All right. Hopefully we are live. Everyone can hear us. Maybe some reactions, thumbs up. So we're trying this new platform. Hopefully it's all working. Okay, good. I see a couple of thumbs up. All right, guys. Welcome to Good AI. So we have a couple of really exciting keynote speakers today. And we are fortunate that we can have people from across the country and even outside the country. There's somebody here from Hong Kong, Hisham, one of our speakers. He's from Toronto, and we have obviously Matthew from Boston. So, quick couple of words about the group and what we do, and then I'll pass it on for both of them for intros, and then if you have any questions, you should see a questions bar on the near the chat window. So just below the chat, so there are questions. But yeah, shout out to everybody who is here and spending their own personal times. We absolutely appreciate that. So this particular group, Good AI, we started 2.5 years ago with just 5 people in the city of Seattle. We used to do this in person, and overall, the whole purpose was, let's just make people aware of the biases and all of the ethical issues that might be happening. And we were kind of relevant back then, and we are really relevant right now. This issue, everything that's happening around, that needs attention. And so thank you everyone for being a part of it. A lot of you are kind of part of our organizing team. A lot of you are have been here several times, and some of you are here first time. So we'll hang out after the session as well, and we can take a couple of breaks as well during the session. If we have a lot of questions, we'll take a pause and try to answer them. So let's keep it interactive. But the model of this particular software allows the speakers to have a free reign. So they have planned both have planned some interesting conversations with us today. So with that, I will kick it off to Hisham to introduce himself, and then Matthew will introduce and start the session. Over to you, Hisham.
Yeah, thank you, Vikram, and thank you to this group. I mean, it's been like a couple of meetings with you guys, but it's been a pleasure being part of this group. For those who don't know me, I worked too much into the AI business since 2008, 2009. A lot of my work was in AI for security and cybersecurity. We've done a lot from city surveillance, smart cities, mass surveillance, and even systems like crime fight, anti-terrorism, all of it. And the reason that I got into this, because the system that we've designed, it was very early, and we didn't know what type of data, but we discovered through the years that there could be a harm done by the system, even though they are designed for a good, but because the data is biased, people who putting this data are biased. So I stopped a little bit for a couple of years. I'm concentrating on business automation right now, and then putting a lot of research on ethics in AI and things like biases and fairness. So that's me. Up to you, Matthew.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Hisham. And Vikram, thanks so much for the invitation to join Good AI tonight. So I'm Matthew Finney. I'm a data scientist studying at Harvard. And before I was in academia, I spent several years as a data scientist at a management consultancy. So focusing on helping organizations introduce data systems and platforms to their decision-making processes. And also, having the opportunity to get my hands on the keyboard and get the roll up my sleeves myself. And now I'm actually a data scientist for one of the large tech companies. But throughout this, I've been able to really focus on how do we make sure our predictions are fair? How do we make sure we're treating people the way that we would want to be treated if we were on the other side? And so this is something that I think is gaining just increasing importance today. And I'm so heartened to see an organization like the Good AI, where you guys are meeting every month to make sure to advance this important topic and put it into practice. So let me see if I can share my slides and we can get started here. Great. Could someone give me a thumbs up if you can see some slides? Let's see. There we go.
Yeah.
Awesome. Great. Yeah. So many new platforms like Zoom, Google Hangouts, Google Meet, but we'll get started. I experienced the world as a Black American. I live in the United States. I've been a Black American in the United States for 30 years, and lately it's been just a lot of attention to racism in the U.S. And particularly police violence, police brutality. And that's important. I'm glad that people are, taking a look at that, and that people are starting to say, that is not acceptable in our society. Now, something that, I was a little frustrated with at first was that there was so much so much emotion and feeling about, oh, racism is terrible, and few people who were actually willing to take an action there. And I think the focus on police brutality kind of had people not thinking about ways that there is systemic racism within their own scope of influence in some cases. And so, I experienced the world as a data scientist. I know that there are many ways that we as data scientists can make little choices that can reduce bias in our work and the systems that are built upon our work. And so, I thought, data scientists, let's get together. Let's really take action to end the practice and tyranny of algorithmic racism. I think that's something that we can do if we take some focused action. And so I'm so grateful to have the opportunity tonight to discuss with you all both some of the ways that we see racism in our work as data professionals, and then also some practical actions that we can take to affect the change that we want to see in the world. So I'm just going to start with what I like to call the tale of two cities, because we live in just an amazing age where we can have people from all over the country, for example, joining us for the meetup tonight because of algorithms and the internet and technological development. A lot of things are possible that weren't possible before. But I think we also see that some of these gains in terms of applications of technology also have negative impacts for certain populations in our society. So let's start just by thinking about algorithmic healthcare. There are so many opportunities here where we can take machines that can do certain tasks better than humans, like analyze data at scale, and find patterns and trends in that data. And we can have them we can have humans then be informed by the algorithms when they actually make a decision. And that's a really big opportunity for doctors. But I think we also see that racism exists in some of these algorithms. There was an algorithm developed used by a lot of healthcare systems in the US to allocate sparse resources to individuals based on their demographics and health conditions. And an analysis of that software that was being used found that on average, African Americans were receiving a lower standard of care, fewer resources, and had worse outcomes than white patients for similar healthcare conditions and treatments. Let's take a look at another one. I love Google. I think Google's great. I love how Google knows what I want to ask before I've even asked it. And, the autocomplete, which they introduced, in the early 2010s and have refined on ever since. It's a really, really useful function. But autocomplete isn't perfect. Autocomplete not only learns what we want to know, but it's learned some of our deepest, darkest habits. So, and this is a screenshot that circulated, I want to say around 2010. You could type "white people stole my car" in the Google search box, and it would suggest, did you mean black people stole my car? And so Google has learned just that version of Google had learned a lot of terrible encodings, and they reflected that back in the platform. And this just has this is really easy to see. This is simple. This is super interpretable. But there are many other ways where this type of behavior crops up and actually can have negative impacts on people, or the way that people are seen, and the way that groups of people are seen. Actually, and at the time, people were so shocked that Google did this. You can go on Google Trends and you can see that in 2010, I think it's February 2010, you see a spike. All of a sudden, "white people stole my car" is like a top search term on Google for that month. And that was because people were trying to figure out if Google really did this. They've since corrected it, but you see with Google Translate, for example, if you type the doctor, it'll say, it'll give you a male pronoun. And if you type the nurse, it'll give you a female pronoun. So, we will still see this for some time if we don't take action to correct it. And I want to just chat about one more example here. This is something that, perhaps you've seen the movie Minority Report, where we have the ability to predict who's going to commit crimes and what crimes are they going to commit. And we have some people, some really smart people at the University of Pennsylvania that are working hard to make that a reality in our society today. And the promise is that it'll make us safer, it'll reduce crime. We'll have better outcomes for policing. But actually, earlier in the year that this article was published, describing the effort at the University of Pennsylvania, many of you might be familiar with the ProPublica investigation of the COMPAS algorithm, which is essentially used to predict whether or not someone will commit another crime while they are waiting to be tried in a court of law. And so this is really important. People, under our Constitution in the US, we have the presumption of innocence until you're proven guilty. But yet, the pretrial bail system is a way that we can actually deny someone their freedom while they're presumed innocent. And what this ProPublica investigation found was that the algorithm that was used to make recommendations on who should be spending the night in jail before trial, that algorithm had racial biases encoded in it. It's the Sylvia, it's the COMPAS algorithm. I believe it's COMPAS, 1S. So this is just, I think wrong on so many levels. It's not what we want to see in our society. It's certainly not something that we want to see happening in a court of law, where I think we presume that things should be fair. But unfortunately, unchecked, these algorithmic tools can have a disparate impact on Black Americans and reinforce the system of racism against Black Americans that's been in place for 400 years. So there are so many more of those examples that we could, discuss, and we could spend the whole evening discussing those, but I want to just highlight some takeaways that I had. Systemic racism has many algorithmic expressions. It's not only about police. It's not only about, police brutality. There are other really urgent and prescient areas where you see systemic racism, and a lot of them are driven by algorithms today. I think we also saw that across the examples we discussed, the developers of the algorithms had good intentions, but good intentions don't make you immune to algorithmic racism. It would be so much easier if we only had racist algorithms when people, a caricature of a racist was sitting behind their computer trying to figure out how they could design something that, treats one group of people differently. But I think what we do see is that algorithmic racism can crop up due to negligence or ignorance often. And it doesn't have to be intentional, but it's still there. And then this is something that, I think is probably the most important point. In a system of racism, individuals will face repeated exposure to algorithms that treat them unfairly in all kinds of different contexts of their life. So you might be exposed to an algorithm that gave you a healthcare treatment that was less impactful for you than another treatment you were qualified for. Or you might have an algorithm that denies you a loan, even though a person of a different race who had similar income and credit score was able to get the loan.
Yeah, before we could go a little bit further, Matthew, we have a question from Sylvia, and she was asking, what is the name of the algorithm? I think that was of the first one.
Right, yeah. So we were talking about this one, the compass algorithm.
Okay,
Yeah.
she said he answered. Yeah.
Awesome.
And another one, they said, did the algorithmic racism occur due to the training data or algorithm? That's an important one.
Yeah, that's a very important one. So, Kate, there were two. I think you should read the ProPublica investigation because they do a great job explaining it. But I'll highlight, the highlights there.
Okay.
They found that there's some influence of the data. If your data only has people who go to jail, you don't know what they would have done if they did not go to jail.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to learn that these people with these qualities need to go to jail, but you don't have any counterfactual that says that they would not have committed a crime if they were allowed to be free.
Yeah.
And then the second, I think big factor there was the choice of features. So, you can choose features, like you can choose to include zip code in your predictor of criminality. And there are lots of ways where zip code redundantly encodes race, especially in the US, where there are some neighborhoods that are majority Black and other neighborhoods that are majority white. But something else that you see with zip codes is that there are certain zip codes where police spend more time. And if a police officer spends more time there, the person who lives there is more likely to be arrested.
Yeah, of course. But that's what we call the geographical segregation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think you'll see that you will have, data plays a big role. The training data plays a huge role.
Yes.
But there are also choices that you make as a developer of an algorithm and the features that you use that can also result in unintentional disparate impact based on protected classes such as race.
Okay.
Awesome. Any more questions?
Yeah. Go ahead, and if I notice something, I'll let you know, because I know that you want to take your time. Things about. we'll see what people are having while you're going through this.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Hisham.
No
And,
problem.
please keep the questions going, everyone.
Yeah.
I think we were uncomfortable with a lot of those use cases I just described because they were unfair. But I think at this point, it's really important to define what is fair, so that we have a common standard that we'll be using throughout the rest of my little talk tonight.
Yeah, there's one. Just a second. There's one, but I think it's not for you. It's for Vikram. They're asking if it's being recorded. So I think Vikram should address that, because I honestly, you and I don't know, but just wanted to let you know. So you can please go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah, I think Vikram responded to that when he said it should be recorded, but it's our first time using it, so he's unsure.
Yeah, I'm here. Okay.
So yeah, let's dive into a couple definitions of fairness that we can keep in the back of our minds as we go through the remarks tonight. There are two main definitions of fairness that I think you'll see in the algorithmic fairness literature. There are lots of flavors of this too, but they boil down to a concept of individual fairness, which is the idea that people who are similar should be treated similarly by an algorithm. And then there's a concept of group fairness, which is that protected groups, minority groups, should have similar treatment to the majority group or the population as a whole. So I'll give a couple examples. Individual fairness, where similar individuals are treated similarly. An example of that might be that a man and a woman who have the same income, who have the same years in their role, will have a similar chance of being promoted or recommended for promotion by an algorithm. The concept of group fairness might instead say that among all of the people who work for a company, men and women should be promoted at the same rate on average. So there's a nuance there. The difference is kind of nuanced, but I think what it really comes down to is, as an individual, you might be unsatisfied with group fairness because it doesn't treat you as an individual. It might only treat you as a member of your protected or unprotected group. And so, I think in our society where there's an emphasis on individuality, individual fairness is something where we're seeing a lot more of the applications of algorithmic fairness going, especially as we have better ability to compute. I want to return, though, to one specific example to talk really explicitly about how algorithmic unfairness can put Black lives at risk. And I think this is important in the broader conversation we're having today about Black Lives Matter in the United States. So let's talk about kidney function. There's an algorithm that is used to measure someone's kidney function. Essentially, there's an index called the glomerular filtration rate that is like a high-level index of, is your kidney doing well or not? But it's not something that you can measure directly in a clinical setting. So you have to have a way that you can estimate it based on information that's available, to the doctor at the bedside and with simple lab tests. So they've developed the CKD EPI equation that estimates EGFR as a function of creatine levels. Creatine levels, I think it's important to note, they're influenced by muscle mass. So what's going on here is that the medical understanding is that someone who has a higher muscle mass, who has the same kidney function as someone else who has a lower muscle mass, the person with the higher muscle mass will also have a higher creatine level for the similar kidney function. And because there's that relationship with muscle mass and creatine and kidney function, medical doctors, when they developed the CKD EPI and put into practice in the United States, decided that you need two versions of this calculation to estimate GFR. So there's one version of eGFR for African Americans who on average have a higher muscle mass. And there's a second version of eGFR for everyone else. Right, and you know, you can see on the distributions on the right, the mean muscle mass for Black Americans is higher on average than that for white Americans, but most of the distributions overlap. So that alone doesn't tell you much about any individual's muscle mass. But it's still, you know, that's still what the doctors decided should be the way to determine whether or not someone needs to have this adjusted eGFR calculation applied for them. So what does this mean in practice? All else equal, for any individual, their eGFR African American score will be 15.9% higher than their eGFR score. And there's actually a cutoff for, there's a clinical cutoff for whether or not you have kidney failure. And if your eGFR is too high, then you won't have kidney failure. And if it's too low, if it's lower than the cutoff, you will have kidney failure.
So we have a couple of things, if we can, before you move on. Sylvia says, what about equity? Not sure. With this slide or this slide before that?
Right. I think the equity questions probably tagged to this slide about, group fairness. Awesome.
Yes, group fairness, yeah.
Great. How about this?
Yeah.
Let me get through this kidney thing quickly, because there's another slide that's related to this one, and then we'll go back to the group fairness, because I don't want to lose the really important point here, which is that an African American will get a higher score for their kidney function just because they're Black. And, you know, it has nothing to do with their actual kidney function. So let's make this real. Let's talk about our patient, Michelle, who has symptoms of kidney failure and probably needs a new kidney. Her doctor measures her kidney function using GFR, and they get the eGFR actually, because they're in a clinical setting. And so Michelle's doctor reports Michelle's eGFR African American score to the hospital's transplant board. And Michelle's score is actually right on the cutoff. So her eGFR African American score is, let's say, 16, and her eGFR regular score is lower than 15. So if Michelle was a white woman, you know, with the same age and kidney function, she would qualify for a kidney transplant. But because Michelle is Black, her doctor says, well, Michelle needs to have the eGFR African American score, since Black people on average have more muscle mass than white people. And Michelle's score is above 15, and she does not meet the clinical cutoff for kidney failure. And as a result, she'll be placed on the wait list behind every other candidate for a kidney that has kidney failure. So what's really important here, I think, to note is that race is used as a proxy for something else that's more informative. Race is used as a proxy for muscle mass. For some reason, the US medical system decided that they would have an easier time measuring someone's race than directly estimating their muscle mass. And so they decided that they would make race the determining factor, essentially, for you know, whether or not you get a lower score that helps you qualify for the kidney transplant. And you see this in the health outcomes as well. So African Americans spend almost 3 times as much time on the waiting list for a kidney as white Americans. It's really, really dangerous, and no one else does this. Only the US does this. So in the UK, they don't do this. In France, they don't do it.
We don't do
And
it in Canada as well.
yeah, Brazil, they don't do it. There are papers out there endorsed by the medical authorities of those jurisdictions where they say this is not appropriate for our population, and somehow the race correction is still used in the US. And that has an impact on people's lives. People die because of this. So on that happy note, let's talk about group fairness again and the equity. So I think there are like these two concepts of algorithmic fairness, and they also have to tie into concepts of fairness in the real world, which I think are a lot of them are, for example, equal opportunity, equal outcome, equal treatment, and equity. And depending on your use case, I think there are like really specific relationships that say, okay, group fairness is, for this use case, approximates equal outcomes. Individual fairness, for this use case, approximates equal treatment. Equity, though, I think is an interesting one because, my understanding is that it implies that there is something that we don't see in the data, but that drives what the ideal distribution of outcomes should be. And so there's, to my knowledge, not an explicit algorithmic fairness concept that leads to equity, but it's definitely something that you as a designer of algorithms might want to have in mind. Sylvia, I hope that, maybe doesn't quite answer your question, but at least, you know what I think about it now. And then let's see, there was another question. What do we know, or how can we deal with the bias that may exist in the label outcome?
Yeah, let me just because we have here two questions that I think they are actually related. I just kept them because I think we should take them at the end. So one of them from Asim, it says what are some good ways to sanitize the data that might be unintentionally discriminative? And I think it's also related to the other question from Ebenezer. It's what do we know, or how can we deal with the bias that may exist in the label outcome variable in training data, i.e. the potentially biased human decision making? That I think these two questions are talking about the same topic. If we can weigh on both of them.
Yeah. So this is really important as well, because I think the Compass example illustrates how there can be bias encoded in your training data that you might not even know is there, or if you do know is there, you don't have another unbiased set of data to use in its place. One approach that I think you'll see out there is what do they call this? It is adversarial. Basically, use an adversarial network to remove the bias from your training data. So you could think about it as, let's use a concrete example because I think that's a little bit easier. Let's say we know that a lot of Black people live in a certain zip code, right? And so in our data that we're using to help a bank predict whether or not someone qualifies for a loan, we have access to zip code and we have access to income. And we know that Black people on average have lower income, and a lot of Black people live in one zip code and relatively fewer Black people live in another zip code, right? So there's protected information that is encoded in our training data, but we don't have the explicit race variable there. Nonetheless, we could still make decisions where we've essentially inferred race based on the other characteristics that we have. And so you would use this adversarial network to try, and it's almost like a game. You try to predict the race based on the encoded information, and then you have another network that says, okay, let's change the source information so that you can't predict race. And you run that game back and forth over and over until you have no ability to predict race from the source data because it's been changed so many times. What you hope is that after you've done that, you still have the information that you need to predict your target variable, which this whole time was whether or not someone is qualified for a loan. So that's one approach. It doesn't work for all use cases, though. It can be computationally expensive, which is a challenge. And then, sometimes you might eliminate all the information and you only have noise left, and so that also is not going to be good for every prediction use case. So I hope that answers the question. But feel free to raise your hand or put another question if there's something else you had in mind.
Yeah, I think there is a thing from KB Jones. Race is not easier than other measures. Race is populated data and easier, between quotes. In my opinion, the algorithm must use data appropriately. Equity is dependent on SME of medical data and translating. I'm not sure if that's just a comment or a question, or you want to comment on that, Matthew?
Yeah. So Kate, I think you're entirely right. People think race is easier because it might already be there in the system, or sometimes they think they can look at someone and guess their race. I'd also argue you can look at someone and have probably a better chance of guessing whether they're muscular or not than guessing their race, especially in a country like the U.S. where people just have so complex ancestral backgrounds. So I totally agree with you there. They used race, and this was developed a long time ago when maybe that was considered acceptable. But race is not the thing that drives the creatine level, which in turn is a measure of kidney function. It's muscle mass, and it's very lazy to use race instead.
Yeah, and there's the follow-up is race shouldn't be used in casualty statements, right?
That's another really interesting ethical question. It depends. I'd have to say it depends on the application of the use case. I would think for most things, race is not a causal factor. But again, there are some scenarios where race might be a causal factor. If you're looking, let's say you had toy example. Let's say you had an algorithm where you wanted to predict who was suffering from systemic disadvantage in the U.S. Race might be a great causal factor for that. So you could even say to make it less of a toy example and more real, you might see that race is sometimes used as a factor in college admissions decisions, which is legal in the United States, because there is that really explicit connection between race and the outcome that you're trying to measure, which is, I'd say in most times, if you're using race to measure an outcome, the outcome you're measuring has to do with the experience of someone being in a certain race.
All right. I think Vikram should come in, and should we continue to the other session? You're done, Matthew, right?
Not quite, but I'll run through this part a little bit more quickly. I think there are things that we can do besides be concerned about this, and that's what I want to talk about now. I hope everyone out here will go out and say, let's end algorithmic bias and not let it overcome our bias towards action. So there are a couple of things that we can all think about. We can think about education. So are we educating our teams and our end users about the reality with how computers are fallible and how they can lead to greater bias or amplify bias that exists. There's a lot of research out there about computational approaches to ensuring fairness and creating fair outcomes in a way that's mathematically guaranteed. We can think about, okay, in the practice of applying algorithms, how are we doing that in a way that leads to lower racism? And then finally, I think something that underlies all of these is representation. So making sure that the people who are using and researching and developing algorithms are representative of the population that they're predicting on. I want to dive into practice quickly. So this is something where I think there's relatively less out there and less effort. And this is where my own personal research is. Why is algorithmic fairness a hard problem in practice? There are a couple challenges. Fairness is really hard to define, and it's application specific, it's context specific. Fairness is also hard to measure, especially if you've not defined it. I want to propose for that what I call a fairness statement, and I'll describe that on the next slide, but at a high level, that's your commitment to some defined and measurable fairness goals. That's application specific. Another set of challenges we see is that there's a lack of transparency that makes algorithmic fairness difficult. And there's a lack of accountability, right? So, you implement an algorithm, you put it out there, no one knows what's going on, maybe not even you. People certainly don't have insight into whether or not how their prediction was made. And you're not accountable to anyone or anything once that's out there, except for maybe the law. And we're seeing that the law doesn't know how to regulate this space. Something I propose for that is what I call the algorithmic practice audit. It's an independent third-party review of processes and outcomes that you use to build your algorithm. So let's dive in a little deeper. What exactly is the fairness statement? It's an application-specific commitment to some defined and measurable fairness goals. And you might recognize some of this in what we see as privacy statements, where you define your privacy objective. We're similarly going to define a fairness objective if it's individual fairness or group fairness or statistical parity or equal opportunity. You'll define that. And then you'll document potential sources of bias that exist in the context of your fairness goal. And finally, you'll identify appropriate controls that will help you mitigate any unacceptable risks and unacceptable sources of bias. All of this is relative to your fairness objective and your application-specific context. A couple benefits of this. So you're going to have a named problem and a named goal. And in all of my years of consulting, I've always found it easier to work towards something once you can name it. If you can't name it, you don't know what you need to work towards. It will help you inform choices and trade-offs as you develop and deploy your algorithms. So sometimes you might say, well, I can get more accuracy if I do this. But then if it involves, using race or zip code as a predictor, you might say, actually, I'm not going to do that. That's not a trade-off we'll accept. It can help you catch problems early. Just by thinking through your plan, you might identify something that is an unacceptable risk before you've even started any development, and that's a win. And finally, it gives you something to measure your progress against. Instead of having a really vague and cloudy fairness goal, you have something hard and specific to anchor against. Let's talk about this audit. Again, this is inspired by something that's outside of the algorithmic world. Publicly traded companies are required to go through periodic audits of their financial statements. Financial statements change over time, but every year they go through an audit where the statement itself is certified, the results that they report in the statement is certified, the process that they use to build the statement is certified, and then the processes that they use in their financial accounting throughout the whole year are also certified as part of this audit. And I think we can do something similar with algorithms and fairness. So you'll look at the process and the outcomes for developing and deploying the algorithm. That might include questions like, is your training data representative? Or do you have a training data set to train facial recognition that has no Black people in it? Are you using known fair classes of algorithms? So for example, those are some of the things coming out of research papers like multi-calibration. On the outcomes side, we'll look at, does your model meet its stated fairness goals? So if you said you want to have equal statistical parity, do you have statistical parity? Or if you want to have equal error rates, are the error rates equal? Then it'll also look at whether or not humans are introducing bias, and what one of my mentors calls the last mile of data science, where you've made a prediction and you need a human to go and actually implement it with a decision. So a couple quick benefits of this. It's a great signal to your consumers and shareholders that your algorithmic services are correct and fair, especially in a world where there's increasing competition among people who can provide algorithmic services. I think there's also a benefit in being able to take pride in knowing that you've done the right thing. I think people who do data science are generally caring people. I think they generally want to do good in the world. A lot of people want to use their work to improve outcomes for other humans. And so let's have an opportunity to reward ourselves for doing exactly that when we've been able to accomplish it. I want to close by talking about ways that we, us, you, will specifically take action to end algorithmic racism, because I think we care about it a lot. And so that means we should act within our own scope of influence. So I'll come back to this diagram and talk about your homework after this talk. I think first you need to make sure that you're educating your friends and your family and your teams and your users about common vectors of algorithmic bias. There's a lot of books out there that I think are really helpful in making this accessible to people who don't have a statistics degree. One that came out recently is Aaron Roth's book, The Ethical Algorithm. I think we also have a duty as data practitioners to keep up with the state of the art in our field. So there are a lot of papers out there that talk about new approaches for getting computational fairness guarantees, and you can go read them. You can also watch the lectures that describe them, which I think is just as useful. So a couple of weeks ago, Harvard had this symposium on the foundations of responsible computing, and you can Google that, and you can watch all the lectures where they talk about different new approaches that are in the journals but not put in practice yet, which could give us more fair prediction outcomes. Let's talk about things you can do in practice. There's no reason that you can't go home tonight and write your fairness statement for the algorithms that you're working on, or at least start drafting that with your team in the office tomorrow. So please, please, please do that. Let's start really committing to what we want to do and thinking critically about how racism and systemic bias can come up in our work. And finally, on the representation piece, this is something I think we all can do as well. Let's be intentional about how we're recruiting people on our teams to make sure that our teams are representative of society at large. I think this call is actually super, super diverse and representative. Most places where I go and talk to a bunch of data scientists, I see a lot of people from one gender and one race, and that just doesn't represent our society, and you're going to get poor outcomes when that's the only frame of mind you have. I think you can also really make sure that in your teams you're making space for underrepresented voices. So it's not good enough just to have a diverse team. You also want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable to share and to voice their ideas and their opinions, and that's probably the only way that we're going to be able to make real progress on ending systemic racism. So thank you all for your time tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and the questions that have come up. I want to turn it over now to Hisham, and then I think we'll be able to take more questions or have a discussion at the end.
Hey, thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you so much for the session. It was really, really well articulated, and it's a sensitive issue. So it's always tricky how to talk about this issue. So thank you so much. I personally learned a lot. I wanted to just take a quick pause and see if anybody would like to just use that raise hand option. And if you have any comment, if you want to say something to everybody, just click on that raise hand, and one by one, I will be able to bring you live on video to ask a question live. I know it's been very interactive conversation so far, but if anybody wants to just say a few words, just use that raise hand option right above the chat. Hisham, we weren't able to hear you earlier, so just FYI.
I'm okay.
Yeah,
Can you hear me now?
you're set up. Yes. Okay. I am not seeing any raised hands yet. So can I call up a few volunteers here? Sangdo, Chris. Yeah, Asim, you were asking a few questions. Any words you like to share with everybody? Okay, I'm handing over mic to Asim here, and then Chris.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity. I wanted to go back to talking about just the technical aspects of data, and if you could just talk about it and elaborate again on how we can, in practice, sanitize the data and make it so that there will be bias in data. All data will have some degree of bias, and how we can work towards removing that. I know you spoke about it a little bit, but I just was wondering if you could just elaborate on it.
Yeah, awesome. And the simple word that I was forgetting before was masking. There are different approaches that you can use to mask the sensitive attributes, one of which is setting up that adversarial game. Something else that you can always do when you have data that is that encodes bias is you can collect more data, although that can be very expensive, and so that's not always practical, even though it's always an option. Other approaches that people take, you can, if you have data that's biased in that it doesn't represent the whole population, but a minority group might be underrepresented in your data, you can think about oversampling records that correspond with the minority group when you do your learning. So, let's say you have 100 records and 95 of them are blue people and 5 of them are green people. When you create your data set that you use to train your model, you sample every blue person's record twice. I forget. I think maybe green is the smaller group. You sample the smaller group twice, as a really simple example. But those are all ways that you can, try and reduce different forms of bias that you might find in your training data.
And a follow-up question is this: what do you think as consumers people can do to encourage companies into being more careful with the way they train their?
Yeah, that's maybe the $1 million question, because right now there's not a whole lot of financial penalty to companies that have models that are biased. As there's more competition, I hope there's a market solution where consumers move away from companies that are known to have biased or unfair algorithms to other companies that are more fair. But that, might not be enough. I think, if there was some sort of framework like the audit I proposed, where you have shareholders actually directly involved, you might see quicker and faster movement from companies on that issue.
Great. We have Chris and KB is lined up as well. So Chris, go ahead.
No, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Matthew. This was very enlightening. This is a great, very relevant topic. I just literally spent my entire day, sitting on diversity and inclusion groups, putting together a program for inclusion outside of AI. What does that look like? And trying to make actionable plans. Your presentation helped me fill some of the gaps. I think it's extremely and powerful. But how do we kind of meld? Because right now there's a great stage talking about just these items. I mean, outside of AI. How do we maybe integrate some of these ideas that we're talking about and including the AI into these conversations that are being had more organically now because of what we've seen out there? Is there an opportunity to leverage these conversations to introduce the artificial intelligence kind of components in it? I think it's very relevant.
Chris, sorry to interrupt. I'm not able to hear you properly. Is everybody else able to hear? I want to make sure. Sorry, just to.
Yeah, it was coming through kind of garbled on my end.
Oh, okay. So Chris, I'm going to withdraw the mic. Just check your connection. I will give you back again. We couldn't hear anything you said. Not much.
He can send it in text in chat.
Or send the text. I will put KB on video now. Okay. Hi, KB.
So this is a follow-up call. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. My question is really around the actions that we can take at this point. I mean, I think part of the enthusiasm, influence that can be created really would be around legal, definitions of what fairness is. I mean, we can all create some criteria for what we think is fair, but it goes back to if organizations, corporations, companies felt like they had to be accountable to somebody to say that they're fair. There are already laws that are in place that say that we treat everybody fairly. This should not be excluded. So I'm wondering if, Matt, you have some perspective of what we could do to help create, I call it structure, clarity around, from a legal perspective, these are things we should already be doing and being transparent about these things, not, kind of on a voluntary basis, but as required by law today, that we do these things that mean that everybody's treated equally. So I'd love to hear your perspective on what we might do to encourage our lawmakers, institutions to understand AI so that, the laws apply, to things that, decisions that physicians, doctors, lawyers are making today. So turn it over to you. Thanks, Matt, again for being here today.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, Kate. And thanks for raising it. I want to address it in two parts. So I think there's the first question about, why is it why when there are laws that say you can't have a disparate impact on minority populations, why do we still have things that are racist? Why do we still have algorithms that are racist in that context? Aaron Roth, had an argument in his book that I think is relevant here. The book is The Ethical Algorithm. Essentially, it's really difficult to say who is legally responsible when an algorithm is, has disparate impact, when it's, biased, because there are so many moving parts. The bias could come from the training data. Who put together the training data? Who's responsible for that? The bias could come from, any number of decisions that you made in training the model. The bias could, be introduced at the point where you're deploying the model or visualizing the predictions, or it could be introduced in that last mile where a human takes an algorithmic recommendation and makes a decision. And so because that space is so complicated, there are so many different people who are involved at the different stages. I think that's one reason why we're not seeing algorithmic fairness enforced with our existing laws. So on the second part of your question, Kate, about how can we help our lawmakers make laws that better reflect the situation we're in today and better regulate this activity. I think it's really important that we educate lawmakers. A lot of them grew up in a world where computers weren't a thing, or certainly grew up in a world where they thought computers were infallible, and we know that to not be the case. So I think there's a lack of understanding there, and that's one piece of it. I think something else that maybe we would want to see more of are folks like us, data professionals, getting involved in governance, either through self-regulation of our activities by starting something like a professional society, like the American Medical Association for Physicians, or maybe even going into seeing people move from data roles into elected office roles themselves to be able to create that legislation that's so desperately needed. And Sylvia, you had a question too.
Oh, I just wanted to comment a little bit because, in law school, fairness was a bad word to us. And when I say bad word, I mean we got chastised and shamed for using that word. It was deemed irrelevant by our law school professors to what we were doing. And so that's one thing I'd like to just comment on as far as a potential roadblock with using language and perhaps proposing something that would be legally enforceable. And then the other thing, and then I could comment on the other questions, but this is not my time. So I just wanted to just say that because I think that that's an important thing that we should acknowledge, that it's almost a trigger word for people in the law, including judges that would be making these decisions, and legislative people and the folks running government who are often legally trained. So I just wanted to kind of say that, more of a comment.
Yeah, thank you for raising that point, and especially for connecting it to Kate's question. I think you're spot on. There is a challenge that I see where data science people and lawyer people use the same words to mean different things, and that absolutely is one of the challenges that maybe prevents us from having better regulation of these activities. Awesome. Looks like we're done with folks.
Okay, guys, and then we'll be here hanging out afterwards as well to see if we want to network or if anybody has more questions. I also have folks from AirMeet, this platform that we're using, so we'll give them an opportunity to also say a few words towards the end. But right now, time for Hisham's session. Hisham, you had a few related slides. I know you and Matthew kind of decided together what each one of you will be covering. So how would you like to do it? Over to you. Just take it away.
It's just because we have only 40 minutes. So I don't know. Do you want us to just introduce some few slides and then we'll talk about the others in another event, or what is it that
Yeah. So let's do this. So share a few slides that you have, and then maybe however you want to do this as a Q&A, we can bring people. If you liked it to be more interactive, we can do that. And Matthew's here, so we can whichever. It's just your call, however you feel. But we do want the full session, so we will continue it next month as well. But give us a slight trailer of what this is going to be.
Okay, let me. Okay, I'm trying to share my screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Just let me know. Yes. Okay. So we don't have a lot of time, so let's just dive into. Okay, so let's talk about this, the battle of the battle of AI biases in AI. Okay, let me just share a different. The screen is not. Just a second. I think I should share the other screen. 1 minute. Yeah. I'm just gonna skip most of those. Okay, let me go here. Yeah. So continuing to what Matthew was talking about, the battle with biases in AI is actually a very, very old story. It didn't start with AI. It started with our human biases. So the problem with data and human biases is human problem. I myself don't think that there's such a thing as AI or machine biases. In reality, is all inherited from human biases. Algorithm uses data. You know, we are the one who put the data to begin with. The algorithm do not check on the accuracy of the data. They definitely cannot detect human bias, and nor they can also fix them. There's also no training currently. I'm talking about Canada, but I understand that it's also the same case in the United States, that we don't have any federal funded educational program for law enforcement personnel on racial sensitivity, cultural differences, respect, or disability handling, or mental issue tackling. Because I know we're talking about racial biases right now, but I think this is, in general, racial bias is part of a much bigger bias. There's also no official background checkup for law enforcement candidates in regarding to racism, biases, extreme religious beliefs, or political alliances. There are some studies that shows that there are a lot of people in the healthcare system and in the law enforcement who are racist, white supremacists. And some of them were found on Facebook groups. I'll talk about that in a different topic, in a different event, but I'm just letting you know that there are no clear checkup on those people for that matter. Now, I know that Matthew said the tale about two cities. I'm going to tell about tale of two humans, and I swear to God, this was not meant. We didn't do that. It's just happened. So I wanted to meet Abraham Mishal, or Abe Mishal. This guy he's an Egyptian American. He was born in Egypt, but I think he came to the United States as a young boy. So he was straight up citizen, no criminal records of any kind. He was actually a veteran, many tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, honorable U.S. Army discharge. Now, his father died after he discharged from the army, and he was not a religious guy. He was just just like a normal guy, girlfriends and all. But when his father died, he was very related to his father. His mental health, he has some mental issues, and he sought some help from the mosques and an imam of a mosque in his neighborhood to take some help from spiritual help on his father's death. Suddenly, he found himself on a no-fly list for no reason. And you can search his story. He has done a lot of videos. He was on a no-fly list for many years, and he talks about that on a TEDx talk and a lot of things. But what I'm bringing him is I'm bringing another case. This guy, I think, I don't want to even mention his name, but you know him because he was actually an Australian living in New Zealand. He has posted many anti-Islamic posts on multiple white supremacist groups, and they were public. It was not an underground. He was glorified he glorified a Bosnian Serb war criminal. He posted a terrorist manifest online right before he went ahead to a mosque in New Zealand and killed 50 Muslim worshippers in 17 minutes. And he posted that whole live on Facebook. Now, this guy was not on any watch list anywhere. Now, I'm going to talk about major AI bias cases. I'm just going to skip that thing. Is like this case, for example, and it's very similar to what the Matthew said about this. Is that those two guys, one of them have a low risk of 3 with using one of the police predictive software, and the other got high risk of 8. Now let's see their records. This guy has a prior record of 2 armed robberies, 1 attempted armed robbery, and the subsequent offenses is 1 grand theft. She only has 4 juvenile misdemeanors and no subsequent defenses. The only difference, as you can see, between those guys, other than the lower defense, offenses, is the skin color. So this guy gets 3 after all this, but she gets 8 after just this. And you can find the information on that in this article. There's a lot of details about how this happened, but I just wanted to show you that this is very recent. And this is caused by AI. Now, I know that this topic is grim. I just want to show you something funny. And this is from a TV show called Better Off Dead. It ran only for 2 seasons in 2009, 2010. And I know this is fun, but let's see, and let me know if you can hear the video for that matter.
I don't think the audio's coming.
You cannot hear the audio? Okay. Share screens. Oh, anyway, so let me just to jump in. So in this thing, there are 2 scientists here. One of them is, there are 2 partners for 10 years. One of them is black and one of them is white. And suddenly, one day, the black scientist notices that the lights went off when his colleague went out, and he was trying to see the motion sensors, but he couldn't. But when his white colleague came in, the lights came back. They discovered that their company has changed the system to a new system, and sensors that works by the reflection on the skin, but it doesn't work only with blacks. And so they get like, the manager gets like, their manager gets like very angry, and he talks to his boss, which is oh my god, I can't get this thing work, but anyway, so they wanted to change the system, but they didn't. It doesn't work, and they found out that that the system, from here, he talks to her to fix that system, and she says they're working on it. Here those guys stuck in an elevator, and the white guy who was there gets out of the elevator, and they got stuck in it because no sensor works for them. And at the end, they come to her, to their boss, and talk to her that they wanted to solve this issue. And then she says, yes, we're working on it. And once they said we solved the issue was this. They would manual drinking fountain for blacks. I know this sounds like kind of a funny and this, but let me tell you one thing. This was in 2009. In 2019, there's this example, this real life example happened. The water tap. There was a company who was trying to do something so the water taps doesn't run when something in the sink, and just by detecting that there are human hand under that water tap, so that it will allow the water comes in, and it didn't work for black people and it didn't even work for women, which is another bias. But the thing is, it's obviously that the people who trained this model just trained it on white male hands, and they didn't even consider black people's hands, and they didn't even consider females' hands. And one of the people that I know, she's also a black professor here in the University of Toronto who have implemented this, and she told me a funny story. She said, like, we have the same system, and I have to show it the palm of my hand because it looks lighter, so it could detect that there's a hand, and I can wash it. But if I show it the back of my hand, it totally doesn't detect what is happening. So that funny thing that I saw on 2009, 10 years later, it was a fun thing, but 10 years later, it happened in real life. The second case that I wanted to talk about is this, I think many of you know about that with Google Google image recognition was identifying black people as gorillas. Now I know that this is it's horrifying. They fixed it just in the end. But the thing about it is, like, there was no enough data for trained or to train the models on black faces or brown faces or even people with non-white faces. So it just gone in, and this person discovered that their friends as recognized on Google image search as gorillas, which is really bad. Now I'm just gonna skim through this. Also, we have a lot of biases that also happen because of the social media platforms. We know that they use AI to show you what do you like and what you search on what you click. And when you click on racial things, or when you have that racial tendencies, it just inflames that. And the problem is that when it comes to news, 60% of adults in the United States get their news from social media platforms. So you can imagine how that inflames these things. And in places like Myanmar, the military of Myanmar, which is supposed to be an official governmental entity, they were relying on news that people are talking about the Rohingya minority in Myanmar, and that caused a whole genocide. So we see how racial biases not just cause like things like police brutality or online bullying or something. A full genocide was committed because of that. I think this is enough for this, and we can talk about this this topic in more details in the future. So I just wanted to weigh on what Matthew was talking about from real life stories and real cases.
Good. Any comments? Any questions? Anyone wants to raise hands? Anyone has any other examples to share? Sylvia?
Yeah, so I guess I wanted to go back to you just had a example about social media. I think we all know that there's, misinformation out there. I'm wondering if you can expand upon the algorithms that are inflaming the divisions that you're just talking about. What is that for me, a non-technical person?
Yeah, well, one of the things that scared me, and it's a case that happened recently, is I believe you heard about a company called Clearview.ai. Have you heard about this company? So those people are actually doing a very advanced facial recognition, and it's like this: you can take any photo of any person and submit it to their platform if you have, of course, an account with them, and it could recognize your face and search everywhere that your likeness was submitted on, specifically on social media. It could find where you are, what's your profile, what's your name, recognize where you have been in any locations through geotagging or posts or the image geotagging inside the image itself. So police in the United States or in anywhere, they were using social media a lot to see what people are thinking, and even sometimes to recognize what they're doing and all. But now it took another scale, is that with this company as well, collecting all this from data. Recently, I've heard that with the recent protests, is that people are taking photos of the protesters, and they're putting it on social media, and the police is taking those photos and using Clearview.ai to find who those protesters are and go and find them and arrest them. Not to mention that a lot of the photos that are posted of those protesters are some people from people who are not that are against those protests, and they post online that these people are looters. They're doing this, they're doing that, and and the police is using these on source without checkup. There's no checks and balances for what people are posting on social media, which what scares me a lot. That police is not supposed to rely on sources like that without checks and balances, and it causes a lot of harm. And people's also when they see these things, it feeds into their biases, it feeds into their racism, it feeds into a lot of things. Does that answer your question?
Sure does. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Any comments? Oh, we have KB here.
So this company is using this facial recognition. And so if you can imagine, if there's not a lot of good data out there, they're going to misidentify somebody. And if that's true, if that's true, that means that Hashim, you look like 5 other people. And those 5 other people are going to get a knock on their door by the police and say that they did something at the state capitol.
Yep.
And they will have no recourse other than to say, that is not me. But they will go to jail, they will be arrested, and they will have to try to prove themselves as innocent. And that's what we're saying here, is if there's not adequate data, fair models, quote unquote fair models, whatever you want to call that, data that actually can be used reasonably to identify somebody, that means that people are going to be without actual evidence to be told that they did something that they did not.
Yeah, and
Isn't that that's the biggest danger? One of the biggest dangers of this whole thing is that the data actually is not accurate.
Yeah, and from my own experience, I could tell you that even before this company, when we were doing things for surveillance and all, there was a lot of cases that you catch a twin.
Yes.
Twins are very tough to find out. People who are from the same family, cousins who are looking too much alike, and the angle of the camera in that picture makes it look alike in too much. Also, there are big problems with, for example, in men with beards. There are a lot of cases even in cell phones that unlock with the faces, that 2 people who don't look like each other, 2 men that don't, but because they have beards, the system couldn't tell them really apart, and it was unlocking the phone for both of them, while it's it's one person. He made the cell phone recognize him, but not the other guy. But this happens, and it could happen. I mean, like, it's a really bad idea to use this. And by the way, Clearview have a lot of cases against them, cease and desist, from Google, from Twitter, from Facebook, and all of them saying, but they are arguing with the courts. They're using the First Amendment argument to defend themselves. So we'll see how that goes. Like me, Vikram and I, we're equally handsome. So if recognize us from each other, Matthew has no hair, so he might be might the system look at him in a different way, but
I mean, one of the things to keep in mind is the pictures you put on Facebook, which are maybe 10, 20 years old, are in their database. So if you look like somebody who's younger, in your younger days, look like somebody who's accused of a crime today, who's 10 years old, younger than you, guess what? You still look like that person. You will be matched. So there is technology today, and anybody can pull those pictures down. I can pull those pictures down from Facebook, Google, whatever. So it's not that the technology is difficult. It's getting the match to work. But what you do with that match is what we're talking about today, is having some checks and balances, right? For what you do with that information, that insight that says, Sylvia, you're the same person as this person we saw downtown Seattle. I go, oh, I wasn't there. I go, do you have proof?
Yeah.
You have to now prove it. You have to prove you weren't there.
Sylvia said she had a twin.
Does she? Ooh, dangerous.
Yeah.
Sylvia Trin could be doing whatever. You know, gotta just go, I wasn't there. I wasn't there. I didn't do it. I didn't do it.
Yeah.
That's the danger of all this.
We have Asim.
Hello. Thank you for your talk, Hisham. It was really interesting. I have a question for maybe Hisham or Matthew can answer, but I don't know if just to introduce a little more nuance in the conversation and talking about medicine applications of AI in medicine. There are like as a South Asian, for example, I know that there are certain communities in South Asia that are more susceptible to, say, diabetes is one, so there is a good relationship between ethnicity and conclusions that you can draw from it for medicine. So do you think in today's climate, there is room for talking about drawing good connections between data and drawing conclusions from data that might be biased? So like, do you think we can implement it, and if it's wise to have that conversation?
Well, let me tell you something. I worked once with a diabetes center, and we have done something for a lot for healthcare. And as you said, it was in the Middle East, and also this is, as you say, in South Asia, and also in the Middle East, this is a problem. The being accessible for specific kinds of diseases. Now, I think the argument here is that, okay, so we know that some races could be susceptible for some kinds of diseases or some kinds of viruses or whatever. But how do we make a distinction that we might include this data, but the race data, but we at the same time do not make sure that it doesn't discriminate? Because, if you take out the race, as you noticed, as you said, it might say that it might be bad because we were giving them lower priority while we should give them more than that. One of the things that I found is an example of males and females, and when it comes to blood pressure. So we know that females are more sensitive to blood pressure. So in reality, if you say mathematically, so if a woman has a lower blood pressure than a man, it might be also dangerous to her, because like if you are like 130 over 85, to a man it's like 140 over 90. So I saw a lot of medical entities who are putting some kinds of like some level of design biases, that if it was a female, so, and she has like 130 over 85, make it look like 140 over 90, because that will put her in the same priority of a male, because that's how this thing balances a male and a female. Now for male and female, it's easy because you have to have this data. But when it comes to race, if we added the race and we added this deliberate bias, then adding the race itself could create another problem. I think this is a broad conversation that we have to make sure that even if we added race, we have to add it in a way that could be, I don't know, anonymized or coded in a different way. I hope this answers this question, because I know this is a long discussion, and the question, there's a lot of questions to answer yet. So Ebenezer, I think you have a question.
Yeah, sorry. It's kind of a question or a comment, and I don't know why I didn't put my first name in there, Lisa. Yeah, I think this is an interesting part of the discussion. I mean, it's all been very interesting, but I think with race and factoring into medical research, it's a huge issue as is, even if we're not thinking about deploying AI-driven, software-driven algorithm. I mean, it's something that in an unfortunate way underlies a lot of our current biomedical research. That's used basic biostats and drawn conclusions and hasn't deployed an algorithm via software, but it's deployed it through a set of heuristics for doctors to use, for example. So I know that like one of the issues in the field that I work in is that the lack of representation data. So we make conclusions about diagnostics, symptom profiles, appropriate diagnostics, and appropriate treatments based off of white males. And in some cases, we should not expect for race to make that different, but legitimately there's a possibility that it does, not because there's something more negative about the profile of a given race or ethnic group, but just because behaviorally, if it's something behavioral, it might manifest differently. There's different cultural norms, different values. So I feel like, at least in the area of having representative data, it's something that has plagued a lot of what we know about different medical conditions. Again, without the deployment of AI. And that's one of the reasons why I find, although that we feel like we're climbing up a very steep mountain, at least in the context of AI, it's getting a lot of attention. Because I think if you go to a research lab on your regular research lab on heart disease, or some, on depression or anxiety, this may not be front and center. In part because it's very hard to engage underrepresented groups in research. So yeah, I think it's a really important topic, and I know that at least for medical research, I think one of the biggest issues is that it has not gotten enough attention, at least in the realm of ensuring and really working to have representative data.
Yeah, and I think your question is also very relevant nowadays, specifically in the United States, because you're now doing the statistics, right?
Census.
What do you call it? Census.
Yes.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've heard from Rashida Tlaib, the senator, is that people of the Middle Eastern descent, they don't have in the census an option to check that I'm a Middle Eastern. So most of them, they check on white. That might, and for many times they were asking for something like that, because the census happens in US, I think, every 10 years, right? And it's a backlog. So when you do it in 10 years and you collect the data, and so it's gonna take a lot of time to take effect, and that affects like decades to come. So and they say like, okay, but this would affect our what type of access to healthcare we have. How are we profiled within our healthcare systems? So they will be profiled as white people, but they're not. Their bodies are different, right? And so this is how also political realm is not representing. The political system does not represent the groups, and that affects their healthcare. That affects their I don't know, access to insurance, everything. So I think this topples down to a bigger conversation: is how do we know, how do we classify, what groups do we have, and what do they have, like how many of those people we have in our system, and how can we help them better by knowing these groups, or identifying their issues, their problems, their healthcare requirements. There's a lot to talk about, and I think this is a very, you said it's a steep hill, and I know it's actually, it's not a hill, it's a mountain that we have to climb. It's like an Everest mountain.
And maybe there are more mountain peaks when you get to the top of that one. You see the rest of them.
Yeah, I would bet that. No problem.
Okay. Any other questions so far? I wanted to take a quick second to also thank guys from AirMeet. So we have a couple of folks. Lalit, can you raise hand? So we have, so Lalit is the founder of this platform, and this is something I'm going to share with people. You won't believe that this is only, what, 7 months, Lalit? 7 months old platform?
Yeah, this is actually less than 7 months. So technically, yeah, you can say they're 7 months old. Hi guys, I just woke up, so might be slightly unpresentable, but glad to see you guys. And I just could join, in the last few minutes, but then I could see the depth of discussions. So pretty glad that such conversations could be facilitated in a meet. And thanks a lot, Vikram, for just getting the community together. Would love to be around and at the social launch for some feedback. That's it. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, so the team. So just a couple of words about this team. So right now, AirMeet has got a lot of capacity to do this organized conversations. And I was talking to one of the other co-founders on Lalit's team, Ash, and he told me that he's actually jumping off because there is a Black Lives Matter protest that they're organizing in Seattle, and he is facilitating that. So that's why he couldn't be there. So I asked Lalit to be there. But they are making this all possible. At least there is, another forum, another way where people can come together. I know there is a lot of questions about Zoom sharing data with law enforcement and whatever else. So there is a safe environment that AirMeet is creating, and especially with the Lalit, you can have millions of people at one shot, 10,000. I heard
Yeah.
some 10,000 speakers.
So I think up to 1 million attendees in the whole venue. So this is designed as a venue. So and we are right now on the stage. So up to 16 people on the stage at any point in time, but people can keep coming and going, and up to 1 million people in the audience, live interacting with you guys. And if you start streaming it on YouTube, etc., then there's no.
Great. Yeah, so thank you for creating the platform. We really enjoyed. This was our first time to host it on this platform, and then most people were okay. There weren't any issues as such. In fact, there were a lot of feedback that I was getting on a bunch of tables that I jumped through. And personally, I really like that expanding table view, where more people come in and the table automatically becomes bigger. So yeah, a lot of.
Thank you. And
Yeah,
I'll be
thank
around
you.
for more feedback. I'll just maybe let Hisham and Matthew just share more of their thoughts. See ya. Bye.
Yes. So just wanted to ask if there's anyone else who wants to jump on. Sangdo, are you having issues coming on? So Sangdo wanted to say a few words. Oh, here we go. Sangdo.
Nice. Hey.
Yes,
Okay.
we can hear you now.
Yeah, and might as well also beta test this with you guys. Once again, Hisham, Matthew, thank you so much for being our speakers tonight. What really grabbed my attention and freaked me out is Clearview AI. So we've been talking about mountains to climb. Well, in the free world or not so free world, governing and trying to influence people to do the right thing when coding and developing models. And the not so oppressed world, no one cares about anything like that. So that's going to be a pretty tough challenge to govern and monitor and influence. It'll be ever ongoing. But I feel that trying to slow down or influence companies like Clearview AI might be more within everyone's reach, because we were always fearful of Axon camera, police body cam getting together with facial recognition someday. And if this young man from Australia who had a really clever idea that's still pretty, from a technology, value perspective, it's pretty bottom feeder petty to go to social media sites and auto scrape images, and now you have a valuable database that they might have ripped off of Facebook and Google and other social media. So while other giants are making profits off of it, they made a profit off of other people's content creation. And what I'm saying is, if there's a young man could be heavily influenced by finance to keep his company going. And I just fear if he has 3 billion images in their database, and that that's going to get even Facebook to want to buy that data back. And especially that's going to influence a biz dev conversation between Axon and Clearview AI someday. And this is, if they don't do it, someone else will. But this is really scary considering, you know, like how quick and easy they get it for free. And because they're desperate for content, they'll say that that is their main live content. And then someone else will buy it. Another company might buy it because they don't care, because they need that data to prove their process and their technology at the expense of hurting people. So I think we need to figure out more, you know, maybe this could be an ongoing standing thing to keep tabs on Clearview AI and where they are, and maybe get in touch with our ACLU contact and really try to do something about it before this young man goes nuts with all the funding and gets any wild ideas with bigger pocket, you know, entities, and they're all going to put police camera and this facial recognition database together. Like, there is a crowd that wants that, and most of us don't. And I think we have more control of trying to slow that down from happening than trying to save the world from everyone using, you know, ethical AI. So, wow, that is scary.
Yeah, I just wanted to let you know he already went wild. He's not going to go wild. He's going to go wilder. He's already went wild, and the argument that he makes against Twitter, and specifically Twitter went hard on him, pretty much on that, and the fact that he's arguing with the First Amendment is so freaking ridiculous. Like, I have no idea what's the relation between you using a data without consent with a free speech, with an amendment that says the government cannot retaliate against you if you talk bad about them. That is the First Amendment. It does not apply to private sector, but everybody's using it now to their own benefit. And I don't know. I think I was talking about Clearview since day one, since I was seeing what they're doing, and I was seeing all of that happen. As someone who come from a mass surveillance background, believe me, I know how that drive. And the last thing we want is to make our systems into the communist Chinese system, who actually put tabs on people that if you cross the street from a place that doesn't have from a wrong place, you could be on a no-fly list. That is that's the last thing. And right now, and it's not just Clearview. Clearview was an example. I don't know if you heard about Pegasus as well. The ones who are the company who has actually a big scandal of the system that they've done in India, and now they're using them to do that coronavirus tracing, and they don't give a damn about privacy or don't give a damn about anything. And that would also create even more segregations, because we know that even with that, if you want to go with contact tracing, that the most vulnerable people when it comes to access to healthcare in the United States are African Americans, then become Asian Americans and all. And if you're going to do that and open it so other people would have more access to accurate tracing and all of this thing, that would create even more segregation within the disease. They will get more disease because they don't have those tools, because they're not recognized to have those tools. And Pegasus was talking to a lot of states there with you guys to implement that kind of a system. And I was like, oh my freaking God, didn't they learn a lesson from this company scandal in India? And it was like, but here's the thing. I believe what we're doing here, what we're trying to do, the awareness, because when people get aware, when people know that what they're doing is going to make me more segregated, what they're doing is going to make me have less access to things that I need, because I think that for the past few decades, we're more concentrating on the things that we want than the things that we need. Specifically, you guys in the United States, you can, as one comedian said, You can get an Uber in a second, but you struggle your whole life with healthcare, with getting a decent kind of healthcare. That's I don't need an Uber, maybe for a while or something, but I could get anything. But I need the healthcare more because my life depends on it, right? My life doesn't depend on an Uber, but I could get an Uber in a fraction of a second or in a few minutes, but I would struggle more. And now with the coronavirus, people losing their jobs, there are a lot of studies that shows that a lot of people are going to lose their homes. There are going to be a lot of homeless people, and most of those people are going to be, again, people from the African American community, the Asian American communities, even some of them from the Middle East and other Southern Asians, and no one is trying to tackle these things. I see you guys going out and they say we want to go back to work, and the federal government stopped the emergency state, so they don't want to help anymore. And of course, we know that this will affect against all types of minorities. So
and low income poor people across all races in general. Wow. So I don't know what I'm going with this, but it's scary because COVID lockdown kind of is the start of a reset of the entire world. And plus this type of technology, I'm guesstimating maybe 3-4 years from now when we have COVID-19 vaccine version 3, that's when we'll all feel pretty good about going to a house party again. But 3-4 years from now, the way things are going, it could be like China surveillance here too, or worldwide.
Yeah, but here's the thing. We do have an option. I've seen the application they have done in Europe, and we know Europe has the GDPR, and and in Germany they have GDBS, which is their own privacy law that is based on GDPR, but even more strict. They use a fascinating application that's based on Bluetooth and on data, but it does not reveal any private data for people, and it just tells you that there's someone in your vicinity might have this. You might need to do. It does everything without because they have to comply with the GDPR and the German law. So I look at that and I say, like, why don't we look at those solutions, learn from them, instead of going to a company that is controversial and known for a huge scandal that's
from Australia. It's not an in-country brand with such information. It's
No, but what I'm saying is Australia is kind of like have a different situation. Don't forget that they have a different summer and different, like one of the things that the spread of the virus happened to us within the winter time while it was summertime there. So that these are a lot of factors. But Europe, we have the same, very similar culture. It's very similar, even weather and the climate. It's very, and we're dealing with them all the time. We have a very good relation. I'm talking about Canada, and it's the same in the United States. We have very good relationships with the European Union. With the Germans, we buy everything, all of these equipments from Germany. So why don't we just learn from them? I mean, like, what stops us from doing that? Okay, Vikram.
Hey, all right. So let's do this. Let's do a wrap up and hang out in the networking lounge for a bit. If people want to chat more, opportunity to sort of see everyone. But thank you so much, Matthew and Hisham, for doing this on especially such short notice and improvising how to, work in this double header kind of keynote where both of you had some really good ideas and insights that we all learned. For sure, it raises a lot of questions as well. So let's hang out and talk more. But thank you so much. I got a confirmation that the recording will be available, so which we will post on YouTube channel, meetup links, everywhere basically. But thanks so much. This was incredible, and hopefully everybody got a chance to speak and share their views as well. Some great points from attendees. And that's really what we like about the group, that everybody who cares, who has an opinion, who has a viewpoint, they are very willing and open to share with everybody else. And we love that. And thank you so much for this. I really, really appreciate everybody's time. And let's hang out for some more, maybe a few more minutes and in the networking lounge. So I will end the session and we will go back to those tables and chat a little bit more. All right. Thank you again.
Thank you, Vikram.
Thank you.